Hi everyone, welcome to this evening Radical Anti-Racism today's seminar. This is our third seminar. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, Dara Iora, Darawa, and Wiradjuri peoples. It is upon the ancestral lands that Western Sydney University is built. I wish to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and the land we are meeting today remains stolen and occupied. I wish to acknowledge my privilege and complicity as a migrant living and working in a settler colonial system that continues to perpetuate injustices and inequalities against First Nation peoples. I would like to pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the culture, and hopes of Indigenous Australia. I would also like to extend my respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people who are present here today. My name is Kwa Yiling and my given name is Yiling. I will first hand over to my colleague, Professor Alana Latin, to introduce us to this seminar.
Thank you, Yiling. It's my pleasure to join you today from the unceded lands of the Gadigal Wangal people. My name is Alana Lenton, and together with Yiling, we are the co-organizers of this seminar series. And today, this is the third in the series of Radical Anti-Racism Today, New Books in Abolitionist, Anti-Colonial, Internationalist Anti-Racism. So just a bit of background. So far, we've had the first two seminars. We've been fortunate to be joined by Michael Richmond, Alex Charnley, and Debbie Bargali, who joined us to discuss Michael and Alex's excellent history of identity politics, Fractured. This was followed by Andrew Brooks in conversation with Charisse Burden-Stelly and Jodie Dean on their collected essays by Black communist women, Organize, Fight, and Win. And both of these recordings are available on the Institute for Culture and Society Vimeo page. I've put the link here on the slide. And with that, I'd like to thank the Institute for Culture and Society for their support for our series, along, of course, with our School of Humanities and Communication Arts. Now, we have 3 seminars to go later on in the year. You'll see we start in September, and I'll just leave the details there. They can all be found on the ICS webpage and on various social websites and so on. I don't want to take up too much time with the details. So today, I'm absolutely delighted to have the honor of introducing Mahdis Azarmandi and Garrick Cooper, who have joined us to discuss their contributions to an important edited volume published last year entitled Towards a Grammar of Race in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The book is edited by Arsia Tekun, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, Lana Lopezi, and Anisha Sarkar. And they brought together 15 authors to reflect on the search for new ways to talk about race in Aotearoa, New Zealand. By bringing what is unspoken into focus, the book seeks to articulate and to confront ideas of race. The themes treated in the book include racial capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness. And a recurring theme across the book is, as they put it, the inescapable entanglement of local and global manifestations of race. So obviously, these are highly pertinent issues for us here as well, and of course, across the globe. There are also questions that are close to my heart, and I was very excited to receive and to read this collection and to go through the many illuminating chapters. So to discuss their own contributions and the wider context of talking about race in Aotearoa, we're joined by the 2 authors, both of whom work at the University of Canterbury. Firstly, we have Mahdis Azarmandi. Her research is located at the intersections of peace and conflict studies and critical race and whiteness studies. She's particularly interested in questions of social justice and anti-racism, and she's interested in epistemologies of ignorance and how they're reproduced through social justice movements. Her work draws from intersectionality and critical race theory, as well as decolonial theory, and she also writes on the politics of memorialization with a specific focus on colonial monuments and the violence they reproduce, also highly pertinent in this context too. Garrett Cooper is interested in practices of decoloniality in Aotearoa. This includes understanding the ways in which coloniality reproduces and sustains itself and maintains the interests of dominant groups in society, and as he puts it, how we might subvert these processes. To this end, he uses Maori epistemologies to critique dominant narratives about Maori and perhaps others, and create new pathways forward that transcend the binaries of Europeans and natives, Maori and Pakeha, the oppressor and the oppressed. Now, they're going to be joined in conversation by my colleague and, of course, the co-organizer of the seminar series, who you've already heard from briefly at the start there, Kwa Yi-Ling. Yi-Ling is a senior lecturer and also a convener of our discipline, the Culture and Society discipline, within which we're organizing this series, in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at Western Sydney University. She is a fire dragon feminist and Singaporean of Chinese, Hokkien, and Indonesian Peranakan heritage. And she's also the author of several books that draw on decolonial, transnational, intersectional, and queer feminist perspectives. So to discuss the book, Towards a Grammar of Race in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I will now hand over to Yi-Ling, and I'll be back towards the end, so by around 8 o'clock, to gather questions from the audience.
Thank you, Alana, for the introduction. I thought I would just begin by something that's a little bit more personal. So as Alana has introduced me, I'm a Singaporean of Chinese, Hokkien, and Indonesian Peranakan heritage. And as a queer migrant woman in a predominantly white Australian society, I've been grappling with race as well. So I would like to just invite Gary and Madis to maybe perhaps share a little bit about your cultural heritage and how that's related to the race work that you're doing now. Maybe we could start with Madis.
Kia ora. I actually just messaged Garrick and asked if he could start us off, given that he's actually the one who's based in Aotearoa at the moment, and I'm currently in Europe, so I might just switch that around.
Okay, sure. Garrick, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Matis. Tēnā no hi tātou katoa, te ripi hea tino la. Kia tātou o tira ki te mana whenua, i roho o tātou whananga, te iwi mai mai anō reira tēnei mātou e mihi atu nei. My name is Garrick Cooper. I work at the University of Canterbury, but I originally am from the North Island, from the Bad Plenty, from the tribes in Tauranga and the Coromandel. And I do have a connection to Australia. My father is a white Australian. My mother is Maori, and I was raised in Auckland City, so I often call myself an urban Maori. So I don't want to, Yi-Ling, I mentioned before, you're in danger when you ask a Maori to introduce themselves, because it can go on forever. I'm showing restraint here.
Thank you, Gary. I'll just hand over to Madis.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Mahdis Azamandi. I'm currently in Barcelona. And yeah, originally I was born in Iran. I was raised in Germany and went to Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2014. I find it really hard to locate myself geographically in one place. I think diaspora and migration is really where my identity is based. I'd probably also describe myself as, queer feminist, woman of color, killjoy.
Thank you, Madis. Now, coming to this edited collection, how do you think that this edited collection speak to the race literature in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or even more broadly globally? Perhaps I would just follow up with Madis, who has last spoken. Would you like to comment a little bit about that first before we go to your individual chapter?
Sure. I'll start us off, and Garrick can probably fill in some of the historical gaps that I will most likely miss. So there isn't actually a lot of race literature in Aotearoa. So I would say, based on my own research, so I looked at anti-racist work in Aotearoa, New Zealand in my dissertation, and studied particularly Pākehā education work around the treaty. and found that pretty much since the 1980s, the word race gradually disappeared from the work that was being done on anti-racism and was replaced with other words, but primarily culture. And that has something to do with the context of the political context of this country and biculturalism, which is the official policy here, which refers to, you know, New Zealand being a country that was supposedly created through treaty. And I say this in quotation marks because obviously we know it wasn't some equal partnership. And because of the recognition of state-sanctioned biculturalism, the word race kind of gradually disappeared, particularly around social justice work and political organizing, and was replaced with the word culture. So by the time I went to New Zealand in 2014, when I was trying to do political work around anti-racism, the word race was nowhere to be found. So there wasn't a lot of literature. So there was some in the 80s, particularly in the journal Race, Gender, Class. There was a lot of work that used the language of race, the language of Blackness, to talk about Māori and Indigenous struggles in Aotearoa. But more recently, that work kind of, you know, became very marginal. That is not to say that there weren't people who were consistently engaging with race in their scholarship, but it wasn't something that, you know, was dominant in research that in any way deals with colonization and racism. So when the editors decided to do that book, they were trying to speak to that void in particular and say that it was actually really important to think about race, and brought together different people from across the country who were doing, you know, work in the academy and outside, and who all draw on I guess, race critical theories in one way or another. So it is still something that is marginal. And I would say probably in comparison to Australia, it's a little bit less. So from my perspective as a Tawiwi, as a non-Indigenous person living in Aotearoa, I always felt I was drawing on scholarship coming out of Australia versus a lot of scholarship that was being produced here. So I think this book in particular is a reclaiming in some ways of race scholarship, and trying to speak into what has been for the last 20, 30 years, a bit of a, you know, empty space academically speaking. So it's kind of put race back on the map.
Yeah, that's interesting because it makes me think about in the Australian context, the absence of talking about race as well, even though, you know, we always think that I mean, you were mentioning that maybe Australia literature might be better, but I was thinking about in the context of Australia, there's also this absence of talking about race, but more, and this whole reference to culturalism. And here we have the culturally and linguistically diverse people as a category that is that's really kind of just omit the whole conversation about race altogether. How about Gary? What do you think about how this edited collection speak to race literature in Aotearoa and perhaps globally as well?
Yes, I would agree with Marti's assessment of literature in Aotearoa and the absence of race speak, if you like. I mean, I guess in the 1980s, there were flashes of it, but not ironically, it was in relation to the Springbok tour and the racism which existed in South Africa, the apartheid state. And so it was in the Springbok tour that Kiwis were particularly comfortable to talk about race and racism. But that's a feature of the sort of discourse in Aotearoa, is that it always exists somewhere else, not here. And this book, I think, is an attempt to really identify that void and that silence around talking about race and racialization of particular groups, and to sort of identify that silence and then to speak to it in terms of let's try to create a grammar. I think this is one of the ways in which the editors use grammar. Let's try to create a grammar that we might use to speak about race and racism in Aotearoa. Yeah.
Thank you,
Gary.
Yeah.
If I might add something, and I'm basically just probing Garrick because that's his area of work, is the way that indigeneity is used in Aotearoa often is kind of delinked from race. So you'll find a lot of work that looks at, colonization, settler colonial violence, the concept of, the settler or unsettler, as Mona Jackson would say, because you need to unsettle in order to settle somewhere, has happened in a way that I think the way indigeneity is spoken about doesn't necessarily touch on racialization. So I think for me, coming from Europe, that was quite interesting, because obviously having lived and grown up and studied race and racism in Europe, I did see some similarities and also stark differences to how I, had come to conceptualize these issues, particularly from an activist point of view, and then returning to the academy.
Gary, do you want to add on to that?
I'll just only add on briefly. I mean, I agree with the sort of delinking of indigeneity from race. I mean, there's been a almost fetishization of culture in our conversation. So everything is linked to the Māori Renaissance and rebuilding culture, and not actually addressing how Māori have been dehumanized through racializations historically and continue to today.
Yeah. Thank you. And I was just thinking about the introduction of the edited collection. I mean, I'm just really drawn to this very beautiful and powerful collection. The editors, Asia Tekun, and Anissa Sakan, and Lana Lopez wrote that. I'm just going to read that particular quote in the introduction. Now we take bits and pieces from these concepts and contexts to identify what we are calling a grammar of race. In other words, the building blocks of a shared language we can use to discuss the complex matter of race in Aotearoa, its connections to New Zealand as a settler, colonial, and capitalist nation, and our positions within it. I'm wondering whether you could explain to the audience tonight about this whole notion of grammar. Why do you think that developing a movement towards the grammar of race is really important?
Perhaps I'll have a crack at that. So my reading, I first come across the use of this term grammar and grammatical in relation to sort of political issues in the work of Lewis Gordon. And I suspect, I know a couple of the editors are particularly familiar with Lewis's work. He talks about, in particular, there's a phrase from a book he wrote called Disciplinary Decadence. He says that the theology and scriptures remain grammatical to modernity. And what he meant by that was that whilst religion and God may have sort of been pushed to the background in the Age of Enlightenment, it actually still shaped what happened in the Enlightenment. So I think it's in this way in which potentially they're using the word grammar. So grammar here has sort of two sides to it. One is that it shapes how and what we talk about, and therefore it offers restrictions. And I think that's one part of the use of the grammar, is that the sort of established grammar in Aotearoa is not to talk about race and racism, but to act as if it's particularly, to act in ways that do racialize people, right? But don't talk about it. And I think the use of the term grammar is to, one, identify that silence, and then say, hey, let's start to develop a grammar in which we might then talk about these issues and confront them. Yeah.
Thank you, Gary. How about you, Madi? Do you have any points, any thoughts about that?
So I maybe share a little anecdote that I have with one of the editors when they first approached me. Was Arcia. So we were talking about how the way we talk about racism in this country is going to frame how we respond to it. And because, I mean, it would probably be incorrect to say that we don't talk about racism in this country, because we actually do quite a bit. But we use terms like institutional racism, and then once it comes to what needs to happen to change systemic inequality, people very, very quickly move to cultural responsiveness, the inclusion of culture, cultural revitalization, the use of te reo language, te reo Māori language. And we were talking of how the way we frame and talk about racism, shapes how we design its solutions. And because we don't really have a language and a grammar of race, we often slip into, these are two words I really hate. This one is cultural responsiveness, and then the other one is as unconscious bias. And how these are actually languages that don't speak to each other. Right. And their bodies of work that don't necessarily speak to each other either, but that in everyday life, that link isn't visible to people. So I remember that conversation very clearly when they were first conceiving the book and, reached out to me because we were at the social movements conference. And Garrick was actually presenting at that conference when I was first asked. So it's kind of a nice full circle to be here today and talk about that.
Those words also make me cringe, Madis. It's just it's really the whole avoidance and the erasure that happened there that really just feels like it's another layer of violence that we have to deal with. I would like now to just move on to your own contribution to the collection, and I really enjoy reading both your chapters so much. I would like to give you space to talk about your chapter. Madis, let me start with you. Can I please invite you to read the introduction of your chapter, The Limits of Pakeha Treaty Work, Why Race Matters to Anti-Racism, on page 138 and 139. For those audience who have not read the book, please get a copy of it. It's just so amazing and wonderful. It will really change your life. So could you read the introduction of your chapter, please?
All right, I need to put those glasses on. All right. In 2016, during a symposium on institutional racism, I gave a presentation about anti-racism in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Spain. The symposium attracted people from a range of sectors, all coming together to stop institutional racism. Soon after my presentation, which focused on white mainstream anti-racism work and its limits, I was challenged for my use of the concept of race. Race, I was told by participants in my session, was a racist term, and using it in analysis was doomed to reproduce racial thinking. Reproducing racism. Culture was offered as an alternative because, after all, fighting discriminatory institutional practices required thinking about culturally responsive solutions. In the suggestions, the categories of Māori and Pākehā is the Māori term for, white people, are understood as cultural categories rather than racial categories. Social injustices in such framings are conceived as the result of cultural incongruencies. Following the historian Patrick Wolf, I posit that race is a process, not an ontology. Its varying modalities, so many dialectical symptoms of the ever-shifting hegemonic balance between those with a will to colonize and those with a will to be free, severally racialized in relation to each other. Race registers the state of colonial hostilities. The common factor is whiteness. The reluctance to use race in Pākehā-led treaty work, so this is Pākehā-led treaty work is the anti-racism work I looked at, I argue is largely focused on dismissing what race is rather than trying to engage with what race does. As anti-racism scholar Alana Lenton writes, anti-racists are very good at denying the biological facticity of race, but not very good at explaining what is social about race. This is particularly the case in anti-racism work as treaty education work. The denial and dismissal of what race does in Pākehā treaty work is visible in how Pākehā-ness is framed as detached or at least removed from whiteness and white supremacy more broadly. I question how Pākehā treaty work can serve as anti-racism when race and what it does are concealed by an erasure or distancing from whiteness. This process further removes from view the reality that Pākehā exists as a dominant group in relation to Māori and other groups who are racialized as non-white, and it leaves the connection of Pākehā to global white supremacy insufficiently acknowledged. It is the relational nature of race that makes the analytical category necessary for anti-racism work. To unpack this relational aspect of how race is operationalized and continues to structure society, we must look at the different ways in which the boundaries of exclusion and inclusion are drawn in order to maintain white hegemony.
Thank you, Madis. So with your chapter, right, you write about the importance of using race as an analytic frame to discuss and plan and even execute anti-racism activism work. So I find your critique incredibly illuminating and important in pointing out the problems with all our current corporatized program around equity, diversity and inclusion model minority, and even honorary whiteness. Can you please share with the audience about your argument and why do you think we need to consider your argument, and what do you suggest that we could do to carry out more effective anti-racism activism work? Can you share a little bit about your work there?
Yes, so maybe I should definitely acknowledge a friend of mine here. When I first came to Aotearoa, I was mainly looking at Spain for my research, and this friend of mine, and I don't know if they want to be named, so I just call them my friend, said to me, oh, you should really look at white anti-racism work in New Zealand. It's quite something. And I ended up doing a comparative study, and it actually ended up being quite similar to the groups that I looked at in Spain. And the reason why I looked at white anti-racism groups was because I thought, if I can find out how these really progressive spaces who are dedicated to change, how they produce the very racism they're trying to undo, maybe that can help us make sense of how racism is still so dominant in all of our societies, particularly Western democratic societies, which was my focus. I wanted to study up. My main focus initially was not to focus on whiteness, because I find we always end up kind of centering whiteness when we engage with whiteness. But what I found very quickly in Aotearoa was when I talked to people about why they did the work they did, which was mainly educational workshops about the history of the treaty and violations of the treaty, and basically like history of colonization, that my participants were so quick to not describe themselves as white. So they would say, I describe myself as Pākehā. Pākehā is a Māori word. Pākehā acknowledges a relationship. By calling myself Pākehā, I honor that relationship. I honor that I am being named by the indigenous people of this place. And in some ways, whiteness was then located somewhere else, which to me was kind of striking, because as a person of color in a predominantly white country, in a settler colony, I kind of really felt uncomfortable when people did that to me. And I kept, comparing, and I thought, well, if you go to my hometown and you take the bus, like, you'd be a white person. So I kind of honed in on that. And then gradually I also found that people really dismissed the word race in the work that they were doing. And it was kind of those 2 points that led me to interrogate that notion of what anti-racism work does. So then I looked at, if anti-racism work is effectively just a really thorough history lesson, does that really create the outcome that people are hoping for? So people would talk about institutional racism, they would be very, very good in acknowledging how colonization has created systemic inequality for Māori when it comes to health, housing, education, pretty much all aspects of life. They were all very much committed to what is described here as a cultural journey. So a lot of people had learned Te Reo Māori, or were learning Te Reo Māori, had very strong relationships with Māori communities, but at the same time understood the problem of racism, one of an unwillingness to understand the impact of historical colonization. And of course, with that framework, then the solutions offered will always sway towards personal conscientization and education work, and or incorporating forms of cultural practices into our everyday life, assuming that those will just naturally get rid of the processes of dehumanization. So that's kind of how I came to that work. And because I was doing this work in Europe, where race is also equally, absent, I felt there's a notion of global white supremacy that disappears when we don't do that. So while I do think it's important to recognize the local specificities of how race plays out, particularly in settler colonial context, that is really important. And people of color need to understand how, even if they experience racism, they benefit from and participate in the dispossession of indigenous people. But there is something really global about white supremacy, and there are similarities that we need to acknowledge. So one of the last final points I made then was, like, are we really doing anti-racism work if we're not acknowledging the superstructure as well of how white supremacy, there's common patterns to white supremacy. And for me, that notion of Pākehā are not white was a really crucial one for me, because it allowed people to redeem Pākehāness as an identity that is worthwhile keeping, right? Like while we would say whiteness as a category, being white is a relationship of power, it doesn't really have any other sort of cultural meaning to hold on to. People are very, very committed to holding on to Pākehāness because it allows them to create an identity that is in relationship with Māori, but that is not related to being white, and therefore to the legacy of white supremacy, right? So it's not quite fleshed out as much in my chapter because I had to condense a dissertation into a chapter. But that's why I really wanted to focus on that. And of course, in Pākehā treaty work, other non-white people completely disappeared. Right? Biculturalism became a country that was founded by two cultures, and that's an ongoing problem in Aotearoa rather than being a bilateral agreement of the Crown and Māori is a diverse group of people, and the Crown is a diverse group of people. That is often reduced to being two cultures, you know, Pākehā culture and Māori culture, which then also creates really false binaries and reductionist views of what is the West and what is Indigenous, which creates a whole set of other problems that Gary can probably speak to better than I. Sorry, I tend to like get into all directions.
I think you brought up really, really important points there. Thank you so much, Madis. It just made me think about this whole whitewashing process that happened, you know, using, I mean, in the Australian university context, we also recently had this cultural competency program where we sent a lot of our faculty members or staff members to go through cultural competence program. And in the process that you think that by gaining cultural competence, it's, you know, you kind of just whitewash that racism and just completely, you know, ignore the whole problem of race or this issue of race. But I really think that you brought up some really important points there that's going to resonate in our audience. I would like to now turn to Gary. Gary, can I please invite you to also read the first two paragraphs of the introduction on page 38 and 39. And in your chapter, Hidden Beneath Tiriti Justice, you really, you know, put together these first two paragraphs that I thought that are really important. Can I just please invite you to read them first?
Until more recently, as a country, we have largely avoided discussing the ways in which race and racism operate in Aotearoa. When race and racism have been discussed, it has tended to center around specific acts of racism, and more often those perpetrated against immigrants. Such acts, the perpetrators and the victims, are more readily identifiable. However, a ubiquitous form of racism established through colonialism resides within our social architecture and institutions. Enduring statistics speak to the material deprivation experienced by Māori and other people, including but not restricted to Pacifica. These statistics represent very compelling evidence of a racist social architecture or simply systemic racism in this country. If not for for social scientists' fetishization of contrived data over real-world data, and if not for the way in which class analyses have been deployed to run interference against serious analyses of racism, perhaps the numbers would indeed be interpreted as evidence of systemic racism. A racial hierarchy animates systemic racism, which explicitly and implicitly organizes rights and privileges. Activists and leaders from within and without the Māori community have long challenged the grotesque and gratuitous racial inequities born of colonialism. Collectively, Māori have achieved significant visibility, presence, and influence in the New Zealand body politic. Māori tribal bureaucracies, wealth, capital, and influence, the visibility and prominence of Māori leadership in both government, bureaucracy, and politics, and the presence of Māori people in New Zealand academic institutions and the business world have never been greater at any time in our colonial past. The power and influence at our collective disposal cannot be understated. Yet most, if not all, of the social indices that represent Māori social disadvantage remain remarkably and stubbornly uniform, despite efforts over multiple decades to address and mitigate such deprivation. Such indices some indices point to a worsening of deprivation. We ought to be actively impatient with such systemic inertia, yet we appear not to be. we might rationalize that it will take time for the full impact of Māori influence and power to be felt down the pipeline, the sort of social variation on the economic trickle-down theory. One could indeed make that argument. I'm less inclined because implicitly it is simply an argument to do nothing, just wait.
Thank you, Gary. I really like what you wrote on page 43 as well, that colonialism never actually leaves, even if settlers do. And you refer to Nelson Maldonado Torres, who said coloniality survives colonialism. And I think that is something that really strike a chord in me, because often you hear people talk about how, you know, that colonialism is in the past. Why do we live in the past? You know, why do we have to, you know, keep dragging this up, and why can't we just focus on the present? So can you clarify, you know, this argument that you put for us in this chapter so beautifully for our audience, and share some specific examples in Aotearoa, how you feel that coloniality definitely survives colonialism?
Sure. So that work is from Nelson Maldonado Torres, who's amongst a group of sort of South American, Caribbean, North American decolonial scholars really come up with this term of coloniality to point out that whilst the sort of structural implications of colonization and colonialism may in some countries have come to an end, the patterns and relationships which were set up in formal colonial administrations continues to survive, and creates a position where Indigenous and Black peoples and minorities are always positioned at the margins of society. So this thing called coloniality is in some ways a push against this notion of post-colonialism, which implies the end of colonialism. They're saying clearly it continues to operate, and I suggest that it shapeshifts. It has different sort of guises, but it continues to do the same thing and serve the same sets of interests. So that's not my argument, that's an argument that I borrowed from. But examples of it in Aotearoa might be, geez, I come up with some really, so one example might be in this sort of intertribal, or not intertribal, the wars against Europeans here in the mid 19th century. There was often delineations of tribes, right? Those that were deemed to be rebels and those that were deemed to be loyalists. And the rebels were those that fought against the crown and British, and the loyalists are those who were loyal to the crown and the British. So in that way, as early as the 1800s, in the sort of very early days of colonialism in Aotearoa, they were setting up this language to position particular tribes, particular groups of people, particular actions as something against a sort of normative power, that which ought to be respected and deferred to. And that was a sort of emerging nation state of New Zealand at the time. So that's one example. Another example, this popped up a few years ago. I got a rant from a Pākehā activist. If I asked you, what's the official language of New Zealand, what would you say?
Official.
What's the official language of New Zealand?
English.
You know that there's only 2 official languages of New Zealand, and English is not one of them. So it's Te Reo Māori and sign language are the official languages of New Zealand. They have special status. But that you said English is not surprising at all. Most people assume it, right? And that is an example of how the sort of sets of relationships and what is deemed to be normative in modern society is, we don't think about it. It just is. It exists in front of us. We all know how to defer to it and recognize it. And that's just a couple of small examples of how coloniality might operate. There are a lot more examples of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Gary. I'm ashamed that I didn't know the official language of Aotearoa. I wonder if your argument about how you were trying to establish in your chapter that coloniality survives colonialism would apply to other settler colonial societies like Australia, where I'm based in, and supposedly post-colonial societies like Singapore, where I was born and grew up in. I wonder, if you would like to comment a little bit about that.
Most definitely, I would suggest and support the argument that this theory is definitely applicable to those states. Anywhere there's capitalism, this is an applicable argument, right? So a lot of these decolonial theorists argue that sort of the telos, or the main reason or purpose of colonialism, is nothing to do with screwing natives over, excuse the language. That's a byproduct of colonialism. Colonialism really is about the accumulation of and control of wealth and resources. And the means to do that is to, there are all sorts of means, and to do that in social architecture, which was created to assist that end, right? So in the context of Singapore and the division of interests, and you could definitely apply that analysis and theory there, and elsewhere, definitely in Australia, of course.
Yeah, it reminds me of what you just mentioned about how it is a shape shifter, like it just, take on a different language, it changed its shape, but the whole power dynamics, the control and the dominance and the way that it is trying to possess and dispossess is that logic remains the same. And so that kind of debunked that myth that, that colonialism is over, but, it has just taken on different shape. Can you also share a little bit about your motivation and methodology of writing this chapter?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess I'm heavily influenced by the work of Frantz Fanon, and so I draw from Richard of the Earth, Les Damnés de la Terre, in this particular chapter. And in Les Damnés de la Terre, he talks about the sort of divisions within different resistance movements and decolonial programs in Africa, and how the sort of elites emerged that were picked off by former colonial regimes and set up to advance colonial interests, even when the colonials left. And this group of people accrued sets of benefits, right? And it struck me that that type of argument can definitely is present in Aotearoa, right? And I'm particularly interested in how there's an emerging group within Māoridom who have been completely dispossessed of any means to access any notion of reparations in Aotearoa through the treaty justice process. This whole treaty justice process, which consumes much of our energy in Aotearoa in terms of addressing injustice, has largely been controlled, not incorrectly, by tribal groups. But the implication of that is there are large groups of Māori who don't identify with these tribal groups, who don't actually have a conversation to address the issues in which they have experienced historical injustices. But the point is really that coloniality and its shape-shifting has now really honed in on what I call sort of racialized Māori, overtly racialized Māori, who are largely urban, not overtly connected to cultural practices in the Renaissance and tribal groups. Might even go to evangelical churches. I got a bit of a hard time for mentioning the evangelical churches in my chapter. But I'm interested in why sections of Māoridom were particularly drawn to evangelical churches. I'm not a particular fan of them, but I'm interested in as to why they were attracted. What did they offer that nobody else was offering them? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also kind of observable in other settler and post-colonial societies, and I mean the rise of evangelical churches in some of the Asian societies could also be observed, with that by the same logic. Thank you, Garrick, for sharing so much about your chapters, giving us all these insights into your chapter, into your work. I would like to just ask the two authors to indulge me a little. So as an Asian migrant woman living and working in a white settler, predominantly, white Australian society, I'm particularly drawn to Ziming Mok's chapter on Black Asian, White Asian, racial histories and East Asian choices in the white settler state. And I'm just going to read some parts of the chapter that I really like on page 126. East Asians in white countries live within language in a way that is ambiguous, racialized, and tense. And then page 129, she wrote, not only are we embedded in a racialized structure of a settler state that deploy us as settlers ourselves, for Chinese and Japanese people, particularly, our cultures and traditions arose from empires that were based on ideologies of our supremacy and colonization of other Asians. Ziming in this chapter discusses Black and white Asians, diversity mascot, modern minority myth, and honorary whiteness. So I just want to invite Madis and Garrick to both comment on this racial category of Asian in Aotearoa that Ziming refers to. Maybe you could start with Madis first.
Kia ora. I think it kind of neatly speaks to what Garrick was touching on before in terms of who are the people who are most dehumanized if we look at the structure of coloniality in Aotearoa and how there's some that aren't dehumanized to the same degree. And I think when Ziming talks about, Black Asian and white Asian, she's kind of tapping into more what the political work is that race does. So it's not just about phenotype and like identity in the sense of just because you are somehow inherently your experience and your voice and your representation in society, says something about you. And I think that that's kind of how I read her work in that regard. So it's not just about looking at who looks white and who doesn't, but it's about who participates in these structures of white supremacy and who reaps the benefits of them. And sometimes anti-racism can be very reductionist by arguing that just simply because you share an identity, somehow you have this shared experience. Or worse, that just because you have an identity, you're the best person to advocate or speak on a particular issue. So I'd probably connect Ziming's work with the work that Mohan Ambikai Parker does on political Blackness in the UK. So he's Malaysian descent, right? And thinking about what are the possibilities of categories of political Blackness, of racism, it does political work, then what are the opportunities that political identities give us? Because they require us to take a stance to that political relationship of power, the oppression, rather than just by mere existence in a racialized body. I somehow am already resisting, which I think is quite common in the Aotearoa New Zealand context. And what I would add to that is in some ways the bicultural framing and the culturalist framing of existing in New Zealand as a form of resistance to settler colonization is picked up by migrants as well. So people engage in a form of culturalization and exercises of linguistic and culturally diverse practices as a form of creating belonging, right? So there's a common saying that Māori activists always share that says we don't need people to be Māori, right? We don't need you to pretend to be Māori. But in some ways, even when people aren't pretending to be Indigenous people, they play into these tropes of what people think is expected of them, and that sometimes is this culturalization. So for Asians, they're either forced to be incredibly like whatever it is where they're coming from, or to practice a cultural whiteness in order to succeed in society, right? And then there's the space in between where people actually take a political position and say, what does it mean to actually dismantle this relationship of power, not just create a space for us? So I think there's some tensions there for sure. And the other tension, I think, is that people feel like they have to choose what type of work they do, whether they do engage in an I hate that word advocacy too, but just for lack of a better word at the moment, engaging in forms of advocacy for migrant and Asian communities has to mean that you can't be in solidarity with Indigenous people. Now, having said that, there are some groups that do wonderful work, like Asian Sporting Tinuranga Tiratanga, but overall, right, like there's these tensions that exist. And I think if we look at the relationship of race, then we can see that the way you act and the way you reap benefits is a much better way of assessing how you're racialized, rather than reducing race to phenotype, which already, as we all know, and Alana has written in a lot of her work, isn't, what race is about. And I think that, for me, Ziming's chapter very much speaks to the point that Garrick is making, particularly around the most disenfranchised Māori groups, right, versus the types of groups and the culturally responsive practices that we advocate for, right? So even if we have more representation than we've ever had before of Indigenous people and actually other minorities in New Zealand, the bottom end of our statistics hasn't actually changed. So something isn't working, right? Like this approach of inclusion and acknowledgement and culturally and linguistically diverse practice isn't really delivering any results.
Thank you, Madis. That was illuminating. How about Gary? Could you like to respond to my question around this whole racial category of Asian in Aotearoa?
Yeah, I can't speak to Ziming's intentions, but I think she's firing a bit of a warning for other Asian immigrants in Aotearoa. From another Asian immigrant in Asian Kiwi, sorry. And let me sort of step to the side a little bit. In the chapter I wrote, and I'll make a connection with Ziming's argument soon, is that in effect, if I was to apply her lens to what I was saying, and I could say that within Māoridom, there are white Māori and black Māori, right? And white Māori are not people who are like me, got fair skin. It's not what it's about. It's about ascribing particular value and what sort of cultural capital and how do they speak and how do they operate and the circles in which they move. Are they closer to whiteness than other Māori? And I think that's what Ziming's really pointing to within the Asian communities. And if I played it further, within Māoridom, there are black Māori. It doesn't mean the color of their skin, but it's their proximity to whiteness, right? And I think really those who fall within the white category, it's a warning to those groups who are really stuck in the middle and not stuck in the middle, sometimes inhabit the middle quite comfortably. But they hold a particular responsibility not to continue to create categories of blackness by emphasizing their whiteness, by being closer to whiteness. Yeah.
Yeah, Gary, I think that's really, really important. I mean, it just called for so many points of reflection there about our own privileges, positionality, our complicity. I mean, it is something that I've been pondering as well about my whiteness, about my proximity to whiteness and my responsibility, as you say, and as my position being in the middle, being comfortable, as a very privileged academic with social capital, middle class, and thinking about the racial hierarchy within this Asian category as well, that is so complex that it can't just be flattened. But I really appreciate both your insights and really important to the kind of race work that we're all doing now and the race work that I'm also thinking about. So I think that we've left about 4 more minutes in our discussion, and I guess this question is for the both of you. You're both working in the same university as academics and doing race work in academia. We all know that that kind of suck, and difficult, it's horrendous, and also sometimes can be uncomfortable and dangerous. Can you please share a little bit what it's like doing race work, teaching race, researching on race, and carrying out all this decolonial, anti-colonial, anti-racism activism at your university? Perhaps you could just share with us in these last couple of minutes before we hand it over to the audience.
I would say that Garrick is a lot better because he's so much better at doing his own thing and not being ground up in the system of the university. But also Garrick teaches in Māori Indigenous Studies and has, I think, a very different student body than who I teach. So I'm based in the Faculty of Education. I'm a trained political scientist. So that already is kind of being at odds in what I do. I would describe teaching and working on race at our university, which is actually overall a pretty decent university, is really hard. And it's an uphill battle. I describe it at home as waking up and getting, going to work and then slamming my head against the same wall every day. And the reason why I say that is it's not because I can't do the work. I'm invited to teach and bring in my own expertise into all of my classes. But I'll give you an example. So I've been teaching at UC since 2020. Every year, I teach about race. I teach about racialization, about white supremacy. I never, ever use the word bias in any of my classes, not once. And at the end of the semester, when I get essays, that word is everywhere. So I'm teaching, against everyone else. And I think that is what makes it really hard. I think the other aspect of what makes it really hard is that we have so much window dressing. Gosh, this is going to go somewhere. I'm going to get in real trouble. But so it looks like we're really good. And I think education in some ways is one of those really, kind of like liberal spaces that does really well in terms of representation, in terms of cultural practice. So there's this illusion of progress, this illusion that we are better than, let's say, engineering and the sciences. However, when you critique the window dressing, so when you critique anything that is about addressing bias or being culturally responsive, you're almost shunned into being kind of like if there was a scale, like on the racist side, because the only way you could call that out is because if you didn't appreciate the inclusion and representation of Indigenous practices. And that, for me, I find is one of the hardest things that I have to navigate, which I think is obviously not the case if you are an Indigenous person. So we are asked to constantly perform ways of being that feel, for me, at odds with my own integrity. And I don't like speaking a language if I don't speak a language. I don't like reciting things that I don't fully understand. I don't like engaging in prayers that aren't mine, right? And I think there are ways to talk about these things of how can we do that in a way that honors other people, that creates space, that creates accountability, but that is largely absent, I would say. So the critical engagement with what are the multiple ways in which we could do anti-racist work in the university are not there. They exist in pockets. I think there's people who have personal relationships and they do that work. Like I, have people like Garrick and other colleagues, and we do that work on our own. But institutionally, it's very, very hard. And then, of course, there's no funding for this work. So that's, I think, the other challenge. So people like myself have to have a set of publications and a set of research practices that are more aligned with my faculty. And that's the work I can do. And that's the work I can get supported. And then I do my work on race and I literally do it in my free time. So that is kind of one of those struggles that I experience. And it's intellectually isolating is, I think, the word I would use. I often feel very intellectually isolated.
Thank you for sharing. Garrick, what do you think about doing race work in the university?
I mean, Matis is right in the sense that the student body that I have are much more receptive and actually expect me to talk about these issues. And that's not to say that some of the students have sort of opposing views and quite very conservative views, even within the Māori student population and others. So in that sense, I have it a little bit easier. I mean, I guess the sort of, for me, one of the more difficult things is not actually doing this type of work. It's the sort of political machinations around power and who represents Māori voices in the institutions and what Māori interests will be advanced within the institution. That's, for me, the more challenging issue, rather than doing race work. Although, I mean, I will say, I've been pushed back by older Māori scholars when they raise issues of race and racism, and they say it's not worthwhile talking about those types of things. Older, retired Māori scholars, they say, you know, that's a dead end. It's not going to help us. But I don't have to worry about them now. Yeah, they've moved on.
Thank you so much, both authors, for sharing so much about your own work and your motivation, your methodology, and your chapters. So now I think we should just use the remaining time to open up to questions, and I'll hand it over to Alana to facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Mahdis and Garrick. I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation. It spoke to me on so many levels. I identified with so much of what you said, and I think we face many similar challenges in the Australian context. And I think but what was interesting is like seeing it from another angle. So it helps you to reflect on your own local environment, and that's always really useful. I mean, part of it is depressing because you realize how much is the same everywhere. And also, you know, Mahdis and I both come from a European background, and so much of it is replicated. I mean, it's unbelievable the overlaps between, you talk about Spain yourself, you know, if you're from Germany, you know how much you cannot talk about race in Germany. I mean, it's becoming, you know, it's like there are situations where people are facing violence. We're talking about the realities of race, which, you know, it's really extreme in that particular location. And I think it's becoming more and more difficult to do this work at the same time that I think that students and other people are crying out for it. I mean, the reflections that you had about teaching are similar. I think Eileen and I would identify with, you know, the kinds of different classrooms that you go into. I think there's a hunger for knowledge, particularly because so many of our students at Western Sydney are themselves from negatively racialized communities. But you know that when they step in the classroom that they've never been given, or very rarely have they been given, the space to talk about their own experiences and to try to connect them beyond this kind of mantra of lived experience to the structural constraints that they are coming up against, particularly in areas which have traditionally been also socioeconomically, you know, less, well, more deprived, let's put it that way. But also there are lots of kind of, you know, different, you know, there's not kind of one bracket into which you can fit all of Western Sydney. It's an extremely diverse, not to use that language, but in the sense that there's a range of realities that are represented there, and different levels of privilege and so on, and access. So yes, so thank you so much. I would like to welcome our audience to ask anybody anything that they would like, or to share anything that resonated with them. You are welcome to do that either by switching your camera on and just simply asking the question. You can use the raise hand function, which is in the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom, or you can also type it in the chat if you prefer to do that. It's always difficult to be the first person to ask a question, but I'll just let people reflect for a second, and if not, I can jump in with something else. Oh, Sudeep.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So I picked up on something that Mahdis was saying. It was really interesting for me. She said, you know, she's trained as a political scientist, and, you know, is in a teaching faculty. And I was very interested in how this idea of political scientists and their activities is, what she says, at odds with what it is that she feels, and how that plays out or how examples of it have played out in the past. I'm very interested in that for all sorts of reasons, not least of which is, political science is the thing that funds activity in this area, and so there's this kind of respect given to a particular mode of activity that reflects a suitable method, that I feel sometimes comes up into conflict with the way that we feel about the work that we are trying to do. So any reflections on that would be welcome from everyone, actually.
Well, kia ora, thank you. So I mean, I'm also at odds with being a political scientist, and they don't claim me, right? Like they don't claim me at all, which is also why I don't work in a department, because they would never hire me because of the type of work I do. But what I mean by that is I'm already outside my own area of discipline, so my academic discipline. So that's somehow where I'm at odds with education. The second part is I never realized that education as an academic field is actually quite conservative. I knew that about political science, right? I think I had ideas about what political science was like as an academic area, but I didn't really know much about education. So I feel out of place, not that I believe in disciplines at all, but there is a notion of me that doesn't quite fit in because I'm not trained as an educationalist. I can't really access a lot of the research projects because they have nothing in common with what I do. And I was hired, obviously, to teach classes about the politics of education, so I'm not completely useless in my faculty. But what I mean with being at odds is that I'm kind of always working against existing ideas that people frame as progressive. So one thing is, I think, to work against ideas of what is the hegemonic status quo, which I think most of us are used to. But in the Faculty of Education, like, I think a lot of people think that they're really progressive and they are committed to social justice. And for me, it's basically reliving my entire dissertation every day of my life, which is that the people who think that they're committed to social change are sometimes the least likely to take critique. So I come out of peace and conflict studies to try to tell a peace and conflict studies person that anything that they're doing might in some way reproduce harm because they are the good people, right? They have chosen to be the good people. Then I did my dissertation on anti-racism groups. These are people who commit most of their lives to an anti-racist cause. And then I came in and I said, well, I see some patterns of racism being reproduced. So I feel that that's what I mean when I say I'm at odds in my faculty. And of course, I don't read the same things my colleagues read. So there's a lack of connection and a lack of grammar, I would say, in terms of how we talk about the world. So I do, and I don't mind being at odds. I think there's power in being at odds because it reminds us that the place we're in isn't designed for everyone to thrive. So I'm not like feeling so sorry for myself being at odds. It's actually a place I quite enjoy. I just wish it wasn't quite as lonely.
Garrick, do you have anything that you'd like to add on this?
I just wanted to, given I know some of the issues that Matis has faced in education, and let me speak from an outsider, not speaking on behalf, but education as a sort of endeavor is rather conservative and is particularly focused on teaching particular ideas, not how one might think about different issues, but teaching the particular ideas that students need in order to become teachers or whatever. And so that narrow focus is actually really difficult to create this sort of culture of critical dialogue and engagement and working through issues. And I think that's one of the issues that education faces. That's not to say there aren't pockets of educationists who are really good at that. There are. They're just not as prevalent as they ought to be.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question that they would like to ask our guests? Dihan.
Hi. I really enjoyed that. I'm kind of really moved, so my voice will have a bit of a tremor in it. But I grew up in New Zealand, and it was spent 20 years there before moving to Australia, and so yeah, I just got so much out of hearing you both, Garrick and Martis. Just want to really acknowledge that. I do have a question or something to reflect on that I'd like, just whatever makes sense. I read an article recently by an anthropologist, a New Zealand anthropologist, about how New Zealand was not originally, the European settlement was not originally by the British government, but by the New Zealand company Andrew Wakefield, and I was oblivious to that. And it was a brilliant article, and her conclusion was essentially that New Zealand was settled by finance, and finance has never been held to account. So if you could just reflect on the intersectionality of decoloniality, the global financial system, and race in terms of, as Alana talks about, as an instrument, a technology for social control and subjugation. Yeah, thank you.
Just a small question.
Just a little one, yeah, just a little one, yeah.
Who would like to give that a shot?
I've spoken so much already, Garrick.
What's that?
I said, I've spoken so much. I need to give you some space.
Okay, I'll start, and then hopefully you'll join in, Matis. So I haven't read that particular piece, but I am aware vaguely of Wakefield's involvement in the sort of early colonial period. I think the early colonial administrators were arms of New South Wales office, colonial office, and then Wakefield come sometime after. But Wakefield was one of those characters that had all sorts of hats. And so he owned a particular land grabbing company, but he was also an administrator within the sort of early settler government. So and then he was also the CEO of the local bank. And so he had all these different hats, and involved in some ways in ordering troops around to push natives off the land, you know. So he was stuck in, we would call that a conflict of interest today. But at the time, this is how colonial administrators were able to advance their own particular interests. I do sincerely think that colonialism is first and foremost about acquiring the land and the resources, and that race was facilitated that. And so I think Wakefield's a really good example of an early colonial administrator that may have leveraged off racism and racialization of Māori, and also war, in order to advance, you know, to accrue that land and acquire land. He was one of the biggest land grabbers, buyers in that early period, in, I think, north of the South Island and in the Wellington region. Yeah. So, Matis.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I haven't read that article in particular either. I would go on to say that finance also shaped so much of what immigration looked like during the colonial period and in the post-colonial period as well, right? So what I teach my students when we look at Asian migration to Aotearoa and its relationship to colonization is that it's not a coincidence that we speak English and that this country is predominantly white. People like to think that just happened, it was just happenstance, right? It's just accidentally more white people came here, but it was by design, right? And there's a lot of these laws that were passed to control also the way in which people could access economic resources. So in New Zealand, there was obviously a poll tax on Chinese migration, but there were also laws on how and when people could open their shops. And that was designed to cut out so-called Chinese competition. So there was laws around when laundromats could open, which again, a lot of people aren't aware of. So I think like finance plays a massive role in which in how the racial status quo is maintained, and it does until today, particularly through immigration. I mean, this whole idea of the point system to me can be also very much tied back to maintaining who's going to be doing what types of work and who can afterwards access residency and from residency citizenship. that all happens in some way through an economic structure as well.
These qualifications get recognized as a big issue.
And I think, and we see something that we see elsewhere as well, is that the promise of an anti-racist future happens through a capitalist promise. If you just do well enough, then you can have a better life, then your reality will look different, then we will all thrive, right? And I think we can see that very much in the United States around, Black billionaires, and how that is something that signals something to the rest of the Black population. And we get that here as well, around for Indigenous populations and migrant Asian populations as well. Is that people don't want to, even if they talk about anti-racism, don't want to talk about anti-capitalism.
So many similarities also with our realities here. And one thing that always strikes me, and it's not that nobody's doing work on this, but there's such a need for thinking about the operations of racial capitalism, I think, in this area of the world. And I think work is beginning. There's been an uptake of the framework over the last few years, not just in the US, but elsewhere also, I guess, in the wake of Cedric Robinson's death and the kind of posthumous appreciation for Black Marxism, which he published in the early 1980s. But it's not something that's been very much studied in relation to the specific landscape of settler colonialism in this area. And, there are certain overlaps with works that's been done within critical Indigenous studies. I'm thinking particularly of Professor Aileen Morton Robinson and her work on the white possessive, but also the late Patrick Wolfe and many others, some Pacific scholars and so on. But in terms of bringing that work together, I think we don't have enough of that happening. So I think this conversation, and hopefully the seminar series, starts to percolate for people, and that we can think about productive ways of thinking beyond, frameworks of Black excellence and, attainment under capitalism, and the kind of the individual as the kind of the shining light for the rest of everybody else to follow in the wake of, and which we've seen so much of, which of course, is appreciated and given space, not only by the university, but also by, the cultural industries, the media industries, and of course the seats of, not that they're outside, but they exist outside of capitalism, but at the heart of capitalist operations, not least in the worlds of finance and banking and all the rest of it. And there's not been enough work, I think, on trying to disentangle these things and really, really try to explain how they function. So thank you, Dihan, for your question. Does anybody else have something else that they would like to ask? Welcome to type it in the chat. We still have a few minutes left for our conversation. I mean, if nobody has anything burning, and I know, we've spoken for a long time and it's relatively exhausting, so we can wrap it up quite quickly, but I'm just wondering, in terms of that reflection, or in terms of my question about racial capitalism, have either of you worked with that framework, or is there anything you'd like to say in response to that?
Matis, you use that a lot more than I do, and I know you don't want to talk, but I'll jump in a little bit after you.
So not so much in my work, I would say, but maybe in my activism more so. I think in the last few years, I've definitely moved towards a more overtly anti-capitalist stance. I mean, I've always been there, but I've always felt I didn't know enough, and I didn't have enough of an understanding of capitalist, economics, and really understanding what I'm talking about. But I guess given of who I've been radicalized with, theoretically speaking, that has always been present for me, because I really, really love the work of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, and she was the first person to introduce me to that term. But I've never really included it in my writing, because I always felt that I lack the academic expertise to do so, but I can see myself now moving towards that more and more. So at the moment, I look at creations of geographies of peace and violence along the Mediterranean border, and I'm drawing on, abolitionist thinkers to make sense of how Europe creates itself as a peaceful continent vis-a-vis a violent exterior, and uses that border to do so. And that, of course, is very much linked to labor migration, to EU economic policies, to the continuities of colonial extraction, and I guess also imperialism in some ways. So it's, I guess, for me, the first time I'm drawing on that work, theoretically speaking, but in terms of my activism, it's always been there. And I always talk about capitalism at work, much to, like, I think yeah, I'm just always the person who's bringing in capitalism. So, but not so much in my own work.
Wonderful. Garrick?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, I think within Māoridom that we need to have that conversation a lot more. I mean, I wrote in my chapter, and this is fairly well known, that the Māori tribal economy is getting significantly much larger. So 2 tribes represent close to $3 billion. The Māori economy is said to be about close to 70 billion. There are different ways in which economists, and so the extent to which we engage in the system and perpetuate it, and create the excesses and all the sort of violent sort of collateral damage, is something that we really need to look at and address moving forward. But there's just too far off the agenda at the moment. And Māori scholarship there are too many other things to deal with. Yeah.
And New Zealand is very far away from that. New Zealand, the Green Party is currently trying to introduce a wealth tax, which is a ridiculously, minute little suggestion that would require people who have assets over $2 million to pay not even a fair share of tax, but a slither of a fair share of tax. And it's framed in public discourse as if it was the Bolshevik Revolution. There's just no understanding of thinking about capitalism at the moment more broadly. While I think that is different, I would say, particularly in Spain, where I am right now, I do think that there is political groups who have that on the agenda. And you can hear also some political parties who engage in the conversation of capitalism, but not so much in New Zealand, because it is the land of milk and honey. It is the paradise. It's so much better than everywhere else. It's where all the billionaires want to go in the case of apocalypse. So I think there are some ways in which, being really progressive as a country for New Zealand has allowed it not to engage in that question.
I think that's very interesting and rather similar to the situation we face here. Absolutely. Although as Australia seems to be slipping into recession, it'll be interesting to see if that's going to change at all, or whether we're going to continue just to hope for the best, which seems to be the politics, the politics here. So Dihan is sharing in the chat that the paper he mentioned is entitled How Finance Colonized Aotearoa, a Concise Counter-History by Catherine Grace Cumming. So that'll be very interesting for us to look up. I'm definitely going to look that up. So unless anybody has any other questions, I think it remains to me to just say a couple of words about our next seminar, and before we wrap up and thank everybody. So let me just put up a slide here. Right, so we are actually taking a break, seeing as it's the end of semester here and probably for you too in Aotearoa. And we are actually starting the new semester at the end of July, but we thought we'd spread these across the year. And we are delighted to welcome Avia Saraday and Shanice Octavia McBean from London to talk about their book, Abolition Revolution, which is a very practical guide to doing abolitionist activism. So it's less scholarly and more kind of practical work. And it's absolutely brilliant read, very concise, really, really well written, and lots of examples from their on the ground activism, as well as kind of scholarly reflections. So you spoke about abolitionism earlier, Mahdi, so this is really in that vein. And obviously then that leads on to the October seminar with Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore, who you mentioned. We're absolutely delighted that she's going to be in conversation with the Gunditj Mara abolitionist activist Tabitha Lean in October. So it remains to me to thank everybody, all three of you, for an absolutely fantastic conversation, led really brilliantly by Yi-Ling. Thank you for your, for your brilliant preparation, I think. And I think it was really lovely having you read from your chapters. I think that really added a lot. And I really hope that this is the beginning of a conversation between these two spaces. I think we've lost a little bit over the last few years with the pandemic and so on, the ability to share between our different contexts. And I know that, there are kind of little conversations that happen here and there, but the opportunities to kind of come together have been lesser. So I really hope that, we take inspiration from today and that we think about ways of actually consolidating our work together, because there are so many similarities between our different realities and so many similarities between our approaches. And I think we, a lot of us recognize, what needs to happen to continue the struggle, which is obviously never ending. So thank you to you, and thank you to all of our participants for spending the time this evening. I wish you a happy end of semester and hopefully a nice break. And we hope to see you back again in September for Avia and Shanice. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gary and Mandis.
Thank you, Yi-Ling.
Thank you.